Wealth, fame, power. Gol D Roger, the king of the pirates, obtained this and everything else the world had to offer, and his dying words drove countless souls to the sea.
You want my treasure? You can have it. I left everything I gathered together in one place. Now you just have to find it.
These words lured men to the Grand Line, pursuing dreams greater than they've ever dared to imagine. This is the time known as the Great Pirate Era. These words have lived in my mind for entirely too long, and as someone who has watched through One Piece multiple times, I've heard them more times than I can count. Saying Gol Roger was a memorable character is an understatement, but that's not all, because one of my favorite things in One Piece is how there's so much history intertwined with its characters and geography. And as I am a historian, I thought today I could tell you about the real-world King of the Pirates, who Gol D Roger was based on. If you guys like these dives into the history behind your favorite anime, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more. You can also check out the description down below for links to my Patreon, Discord, or Twitch to support the channel a bit extra, or to become a more active part of the community. With that being said, let's get into the video. For those who need a bit of a refresher, let's cover the rough story of Gol D Roger. Roger did some truly phenomenal things in his life, however, he is most famous for his final voyage. His crew were the first pirates to successfully navigate through the Grand Line, landing on Laugh-Tale. Here, he learned the truth about the Void Century, the ancient weapons, and the Will of D, while also finding Joy Boy's treasure. The world, having learned of Roger's discovery of Laugh-Tale, would dub him the King of the Pirates. Roger would be known at the time as the world's most wanted man, boasting the highest bounty of any pirate. Toward the end of his life, and in fact throughout all of his final journey, Roger was very ill. Knowing he was dying, he turned himself into Garp to ensure that his family would be looked after, and was scheduled for execution. In chains, he was paraded through the streets of Logtown, where he would be led to the execution platform, the place where he gave his final speech, and as he was executed, he smiled, and the Great Pirate Era began. Now, let's look at his real-world counterpart, the King of the Pirates and the most wanted man in the world, Henry Avery. We should probably be clear about a few things when we're talking about pirates in history. As it turns out, their early lives are sometimes not too clearly documented, and most of the available knowledge we have on the topic of Avery specifically comes from a book by Charles Johnson from 1709 called The Life and Adventures of Captain John Avery. This book is considered to be flawed at the best of times, but basically as long as we look at this with a grain of salt, especially when looking into personal factors, we should be okay. However, luckily, as Henry Avery was, the king of the pirates, we could find him at the center of several pretty significant historical events, and those are pretty well documented. Avery was born in the 1650s at the start of the golden age of piracy. Very early on in his life, he would find himself working on merchant ships, and eventually began working on Royal Navy ships. One of the most famous accounts of Avery's early career comes from the attack on Algiers in 1671. However, we also saw him as an acting captain in the Bay of Campeche. That said, the record drops off for a bit until 1689 during the 9 Years' War. Here we have a few military records which describe Avery as a family man who spent little of his wages on tobacco or extras and would regularly send money home to his family, something which might be reflected in Roger, as Garp recounts his greatest fear being losing his loved ones. You could also make the argument that him turning himself in specifically so that Garp would take care of his family is also in line with this. Back to Avery though, his time on the HMS Rupert during 1689 would see him being promoted to master's mate. However, in 1690, he would participate in the Battle of Beachy Head, a battle which was so disastrous for the English that he would ultimately be discharged from the Navy shortly afterwards. The next few years of Avery's life are fairly undocumented, however we do know that he was active in the slave trade. Specifically, he worked as someone who acted to halt the illegal selling of slaves without a license under the Royal African Company. He would lure slave traders onto his own ship and then capture them. In 1693, Avery joined in on Spanish expedition shipping, where due to his experience in the Navy, he was promoted to first mate almost immediately. The investors of this journey paid the men on board 1 month's wages in advance, and then they were to be paid every 6 months following. Now, their first journey was less than successful, with the ship's captain, William Phipps, dying before even leaving port. That said, a man named Charles Gibson would take his place, and not much better would happen from here. They would travel to Corunna in Spain, a journey which should have taken 2 weeks, but due to horrible weather conditions, they would not arrive until 5 months later. On top of that, the legal documents required for them to get off of the boat had yet to arrive, so they basically had to wait there for several months on top of this. The sailors found themselves with no money and no ability to seek out other forms of employment, basically living as prisoners on their ship. The men on board requested that their captain pay them what they should have received since their ship first left. However, this was rejected, leading to a very obvious outcome: mutiny. And leading this movement was Henry Avery. They went off on their ship far enough to be safe, and Avery made an offer to the now ex-captain, saying if he wanted to join them and he could manage to sober up, one day he might even make it back up to lieutenant. If not, he'd be given a small boat and allowed to leave. Similarly, anyone else who wanted out was allowed off. The only exception to this was the ship's surgeon, because he was considered invaluable. Avery would rename the ship from the Charles II to the Fancy, and set sail towards the Indian Ocean by the way of the Pirate Round. His life as a pirate had officially begun. Their first endeavor was at Mayo, where they robbed 3 English merchants from Barbados, and convinced 9 of their men to join him. Avery was famously persuasive, and by now he had about 50 men on board. They then sailed to the Guinea coast, where they managed to fool the locals into boarding onto the Fancy for trade. However, they would take these men as slaves and steal all of their wealth. His next stop was in Bioko, in the Bight of Benin, where they razzied the Fancy, essentially removing one of the ship's decks and making it one of the fastest ships in the Atlantic Ocean at this point. Soon after, they managed to capture 2 Danish privateers, stealing their ivory and gold and taking on another 70 members for their crew. By 1695, the Fancy was passing the Cape of Good Hope and landing in Madagascar for supplies and looting a few other ships along the way. By now, their crew had grown to about 150 people. And this all leads us to the big event: the famous raid, which was easily one of the most profitable acts in piracy in history up to now. Avery joined forces with 5 other captains. That said, none of them were particularly relevant in this raid. Avery was dubbed Admiral of his new fleet, and together they reached the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. You see, back in the late 1600s, the Mughal Empire ruled over much of South Asia, including parts of modern-day India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. An annual pilgrimage to Mecca called the Hajj left from the Mughal Empire, and this was a fleet which Avery was looking to take on. This consisted of 25 ships, among which were pilgrim ships, warships, and most importantly, merchant ships, which were overflowing with gold and treasure. The biggest of these ships, and the most rewarding to raid, was the Ganj-e-Sawai. The Mughal convoy cleared through the strait, and Avery and his fleet would quickly give chase. That said, many of their ships were unfit for this raid, and quickly fell behind or were defeated by the convoy. Eventually, Avery managed to capture a ship called the Fateh Muhammad, which contained over 50,000 pounds worth of treasure on it, more than enough to justify their raid. However, Avery pressed forward in pursuit of the Ganj-e-Sawai, which based on seemingly pure luck he managed to capture. One of his volleys had destroyed its main mast, significantly slowing the ship, while shortly after a cannon misfired and exploded, setting the ship on fire and destroying many other cannons in the process. Avery's men climbed aboard the ship and attacked, taking advantage of the chaos. Apparently, the captain of the boat had armed his slave girls and sent them to fight in his place, which is a form of cowardice which he is still known for today. Regardless, upon taking control of the enemy ship, Avery's men tortured and killed most of their men and forced themselves on their women. Those who managed to survive were said to have dived into the ocean because it was an easier way to die. Kind of reminding us that this is what pirates were like in the real world, not so much like Gol D Roger. This, along with the spoils of their previous prize, resulted in making Avery the richest pirate in history, totaling in over 150 million USD in modern money when taking into account inflation, and some accounts saying much higher. He was officially the king of the pirates. The crew of one of the assisting ships tried to scam Avery's crew by clipping their shares of the gold, and outraged, Avery's crew took most of the treasure for themselves, allowing the other crew to only keep enough money to pay for the repairs of their ship and not much else. Avery would go on to sail to Bourbon and gave each member of his crew what works out to about $170,000 today as payment, not even mentioning their shares of the gemstones. From here, most of them set out for the Bahamas, and meanwhile, a bounty of 500 pounds, later 1,000 pounds, was placed on his head, drastically higher than anyone else on the planet. On top of this, if a pirate was the one who turned him in, they would be given a royal pardon for their crimes, and as such, the first worldwide manhunt in history had begun. Avery would stay in the Bahamas for a short time, however, at some point, when you go around spending foreign currency at near endless levels, you're going to arouse suspicion. Nicholas Trott, the island on which Avery was staying's governor, had become friends with Avery, and when he was painted into a position where he had to expose his new friend, he gave Avery and his men warning and allowed them to escape before ships had the chance to actually reach them. And that was it. With an almost unimaginably large treasure, Avery would vanish, never to be seen or heard from again. But you know what they say, if you want his treasure, you can have it.
Now you just have to find it.
And there you go, the story of the real-world king of the pirates who Gol D Roger was based on. Want to see more videos like this? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and consider checking out the Discord for more. And as always, a big thank you goes out to our patrons with the Dai Yokai Aikerochu, Jacob Wiley, and Iffy Babes, our Yokai NL Cruz, Blood Wolfmon, Jamie Heck, Joker Rose, Lucifina Akuma, and Sayo Arendelle, and our Hanyo Anthony Hogan, Burnett Thrasher, Kasim Salim, Love the Kiwi, Michael Grayco, Nega Kitty, Randy Mosiman, Samantha Olsen, Savage Camel, Simon Electric, and Kiwi Dog. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, remember to stay excellent.